Thank you, Camilla, for your introduction and just for having me here today. So, to study ancient contraception is to examine the intersection of women, sexual practices, food, medicine, magic, and sensory experiences in the ancient world. Set within wider archaeological inquiry, it also touches on merging ancient texts with archaeobotany. My presentation today is based on my honours thesis, which I did at the University of Queensland, and which was a pilot study investigating contraception in the Greco-Roman world from the 5th century BCE to the 2nd century CE, with a specific archaeobotanical focus. Drawing on previous scholars such as Baker's frameworks for the archaeology of medicine, Riddle's study on contraceptive ingredients, and Glazebrook's work on the archaeology of prostitution, I broadly ask, is there an archaeology of ancient contraception? The desire to control birth is not a modern one. In the second century CE, Cyrannus, a physician who worked in Rome during the time of Trajan and Hadrian, and who wrote an influential book on gynecology, defined that a contraception differs from an abortive, for the first does not let conception take place, while the latter destroys what has been conceived. Let us therefore call the first one abortive and the other contraceptive. It is therefore, it is safer to prevent conception from taking place than to destroy the fetus. I adopted this definition for my project, but this was just one of the many ancient attitudes towards managing human fertility. And one example among the suite of advice in ancient texts on women's health, instructing on how to boost fertility and safeguard childbirth, as well as how to terminate pregnancies and induce temporary sterility. Contraception is the most interesting of these practices because it shows premeditated intentions to have heterosexual vaginal intercourse, and its preventative nature suggests the ambitious attempt to completely eliminate biological and economic consequences of satisfying sexual desire. Despite the literary evidence, and unlike other examples of medical practices, there is no corresponding evidence of ancient contraception in the archaeological record. And there are several reasons for this. Firstly, the assumption that before the modern era, people didn't or couldn't practice practice contraception. And secondly, ancient contraception is a very niche field and little known outside of medical historians who specialize in Greco-Roman medical, magical, and botanical texts. And within this research, contraception is grouped with abortion and usually discussed in terms of ancient demography. Archaeological evidence of medicine in general is also just rare. In contrast to food, medicines are usually carefully curated, prepared, and then consumed, leaving little wastage and chance of survival. But most importantly, the Western androcentric knowledge structures critiqued by feminist theorists like Conkey and Jarrow and Wiley unintentionally linger in archaeological inquiry. The archaeology of sexuality recognizes that sexual desire, like hunger, is a physiological trait embedded in the human body, and like subsistence practices, is culturally constructed. In archaeobotany, however, research into the origins of agriculture and subsistence still dominates the subdiscipline. The sexed or gendered use of plants may become overlooked, as research designs drive archaeologists to mainly interpret plants in terms of food, fuel, climate, and construction. The food medicine continuum recognized in ethnopharmacology and ancient history is also yet to be fully considered in archaeobotany. And because archaeological knowledge is constructed within wider scientific Western traditions of thinking, it avoids subjective topics like feelings, emotions, and desire, and it privileges empirical observation, objectification, and categorizing information. Although categorization is an essential tool to organize archaeological data, the typologies and categories we create to sort artifacts are modern constructs. Concepts of boundaries between materials in the past could vastly differ to how we, with our modern mindset, understand these same materials. For example, the Mediterranean package of olive, grape, fig, cereals, and pulses, is generally used to reconstruct past diet and agriculture. But in the Greco-Roman context, the boundaries between food, medicine, and magic were blurred. One plant could have multiple roles. And in fact, the same species that we commonly find in the Mediterranean package, such as olive, fig, and pomegranate, are also recorded in various ancient texts as contraceptive ingredients. Thus, I argue that archaeological evidence of contraceptive behavior can survive as botanical remains that have been misinterpreted as food. In order to support this theory, I wanted to produce a frame of reference for archaeologists to distinguish between the medicinal and food use of plants. I specifically ask, what macroscopic, microscopic, and chemical traces could ancient contraceptive materials leave in the archaeological record? What was the chaîne opératoire of preparation, use, and disposal of ancient contraceptive agents? To answer these questions, I used Serranus's gynecology as a case study. And following Hillman's classic crop processing model, which produced a chaîne opératoire of cereal harvesting in rural Turkey, I produced a contraceptive processing model by recreating recipes from Serranus's chapter on birth control. Then I observed the macro, micro, and chemical byproducts and waste materials and assessed whether these traces are diagnostic to each recipe. I chose Serranus because he's the most specific author and gives measurements, time spans, and detailed methods of preparation. Plus, they contain plant foods that have been previously found in the archaeological record, like pomegranate, fig, and pepper. I followed 4 recipes from Gynecology, Book 1, Chapter 19, but today I'll just present the results of one. And the standard process for each recipe was the same, which was to first cross-check the translation to figure out the exact steps and make sure I was using the right ingredients before going out to source them. And then the fun part, which was actually making the recipe. I also charred some macro remains to simulate carbonization and collected micro residues and sent samples off for chemical analysis. But I didn't really get time to study these last 2 in depth, so I won't talk about them today. After the experiment, I then illustrated the chaîne opératoire and made my contraceptive processing model, and then assessed the diagnostic features of these products. I compared them against similar published archaeological specimens and other ancient recipes to assess whether non-contraceptive recipes might also produce overlapping archaeobotanical signatures. Grind the inside of fresh pomegranate peel and with water and apply. This is the first recipe that I recreated, and it uses just 2 ingredients, pomegranate and water. Serranus instructed specifically to use the inside of fresh pomegranate peel, which I interpreted to be the mesocarp, which is this fleshy, white, pale, pithy bit. So after removing the seeds, I scraped the mesocarp out with a spoon. Even though he's the most specific author, Serranus doesn't say how much water to use. But the word that he uses for grind is given by the Little Scott Jones Greek dictionary to mean smooth, polish, or pound in a mortar. And the word is heavily connotated with smoothing. So in the end, I decided to grind the mesocarp as finely as possible, adding a bit of water at a time until it reached a smooth paste consistency. And the final product was this mushy pink paste. Based on the recipes, or previous recipes, this paste was probably then wrapped in wool and then inserted into the vagina for a few hours before being taken out prior to intercourse. This final paste wouldn't survive the archaeological record, but the recipe did produce one interesting product. By scraping out the mesocarp, it left this thin, hollowed out pomegranate shell of just the leathery outer skin, which is called the pericarp. And when you compare the pericarp with normally processed pomegranate skin, you can really see the difference. And when I charred it, the internal patterns from the fresh specimens were preserved, although these are just air bubbles. And this is interesting because people usually eat pomegranates for the fleshy seeds or arils. The arils are eaten, the peel's just thrown away, and we see that in archaeological finds of pomegranate peel. Little divots and seed impressions like this are still visible, like this example from Korani in Roman Egypt. These pockmarks indicate that pomegranate was targeted for the edible parts of the fruit. Pomegranate peel, on the other hand, is bitter and unpalatable. The empty pericarp shells produced in this recipe indicate the purposeful removal of an inedible part of the fruit. And this extra step has two implications: that there's a difference between eating pomegranate and using it for medicine, and that this recipe does leave diagnostic waste materials. Scraped out pomegranate skins could be an archaeological marker linked to medicinal or contraceptive use. So this is a simplified version of the final contraceptive processing model, showing each stage in the middle row and the byproducts and waste products. But using this model to map pathways into the archaeological record requires situating these processes within the wider chaîne opératoire of medicine in general in the ancient world, which means finding out about the readership and use of these recipes. Did women really use them? Did the medical information inside these texts actually spread into everyday practice? Are there, any other recipes that call for similar ingredients? And where were these ingredients collected, stored, made, used, and then discarded? A preliminary survey of other remedies suggests that Serranus is the only author who explicitly uses pomegranate mesocarp as a contraceptive ingredient, although I did find a recipe for cleansing the uterus from the Hippocratic text, Nature of Women, which seems to call for identical ingredients, but on closer inspection, there are slight linguistic differences which emphasize the fruit rather than the peel. So I'm not sure if it included mesocarp. It's also uncertain whether these recipes came from practical experience collected from midwives and prostitutes or just women in general, or whether they are purely speculative theories based on various medical schools of thought. We do know that Serranus may have intended for his gynecology to act as a textbook for midwives because he describes the ideal criteria for a midwife, and at the top of the list is being able to read. We also have evidence of women who practiced medicine as female physicians and thus disseminated medical knowledge, but evidence of women producing medical texts is rare. So we can speculate that evidence of contraceptive practices might occur where women carried out their activities, and based on existing information about the medicine trade and ancient waste disposal, these would probably have been just disposed along with normal human or kitchen waste. It's also important to remember that, apart from Serranus, references to contraception appear across different texts. Overall, I identified roughly 60 separate materials recorded with the ability to prevent pregnancy or cause sterility, and these included plants, animals, and minerals. And many of them are commonly found in the archaeological record: iron slag, pomegranate, fig, bitter vetch. Others are just bizarre, like worms taken from spiders or menstrual blood. But many are just familiar foods: cabbage, parsley, ginger, pepper, sumac, mint, rocket, and rue. As I said, this was just a pilot study, and the biggest weakness is establishing the correlation between ancient texts and the archaeological record. If I misinterpreted any part of the recipes or ingredients, then the model I created would just be wrong. Also, if I'm honest, the likelihood of actually finding a direct example of Serranus's recipe is pretty unlikely. But I don't think that matters because the point of this research overall is a thought exercise to retrain the archaeological eye in how we see things and to review how we categorize things. It shows the wide range of contraceptive practices that people tried, whether they worked or not, and how they often involved using materials familiar to archaeologists, but in a way alien to us. It also hints at the possibility of desire and emotion as driving factors for decision-making and action. We know that plants were used to satisfy hunger, but perhaps they were also used to satiate sexual desire. And overall, this research adds another possibility for past human and plant interaction. And yeah, I'd just like to thank my supervisors, Dr. Glenys McGowan and Dr. Alison Crowther from the University of Queensland, who helped me with my thesis, and also Dr. Jet McWilliam and Amelia Brown, who also helped me a lot, and Dr. Vet Hunt, and then Dr. Peter Mowat, who carried out chemical analysis for me at the Southern Cross University, but unfortunately I didn't really discuss those results today. And again, thank you so much for the CASA organizers and for letting me speak today. Oh, and that's the references if you want to have a look.